where we're going to explore exactly that theme, which is the name you've chosen as a church and as people committed to mission. So we'll let that song serve as our prayer, and I want to get right to work with you. I'm going to apologize in advance. I had a few formatting issues on these slides, but I hope that you can see the slides clearly enough. I hope they're big against the wall there. Here's where I'd like to begin. I'd like to begin with a text that is undoubtedly dear to you, and that is the text from which we get the trope, Christ is the bread of life. It's from John 6. It's a powerful image, and it comes, in terms of the narrative of Mark, comes on the heels of the narrative of John comes on the heels of John's version of the wilderness feeding, which is also going to be a focus tonight. And we pick it up here with the crowds interrogating Jesus. This is a common theme in John, which provides John's Jesus as a platform to give long teachings. So they're interrogating him, trying to make sense of the meaning of the feeding in the wilderness in John 5. And their way of trying to make sense of it, quite naturally, in my opinion, is to draw on the central sign of their sacred history, and that is the story of the manna in the wilderness. It's an ancestral story. Now, this allusion to the manna is very significant because it's the only time the word manna appears in the entire gospel tradition here in John 6. So there's something important about that. Now, I think most of you there know that the story of the manna found in Exodus 16 is a very important text in our work here at BCM. This episode represents Israel's first lesson on how to be a free people on the heels of the great exodus from imperial slavery in Egypt. And this lesson is an economic one. It's about how to build an alternative economy. Now, we think in our reading of Exodus 16, we think that the manna symbolizes God's gift of sustenance, the great economy of grace. And the point of the story is to make clear God's instructions on how to handle this material gift. And these instructions in Exodus 16 are threefold. First, the gift has to be distributed equitably. Those who gathered more did not gather too much. Those who gathered less gathered enough. So the first lesson is one of fundamental equitability. No one has too much, no one has too little. The second lesson narrated in Exodus 16 is the gift needs to circulate among the people rather than concentrate in just a few hands. So you're not supposed to store it up, right? It'll turn to worms. This prohibition of accumulation of wealth, like the fundamental prohibition of great wealth and great poverty, are economic and social principles that are supposed to characterize this new society. And then, of course, the third instruction, and this is why we call it Sabbath Economics, is to keep the Sabbath. This is the first time that the communal discipline of Sabbath is introduced in Torah, and what Sabbath is about is the limitation of human activity as a constant reminder of the divine economy of grace. We do not control the world. Now, I'm going to assume that certainly everybody in the Bread of Life community is very familiar with these basic tenets of Sabbath economics, not least because Mike has probably force-fed them to you. We've tried to sketch out this biblical theme and its practical consequences in our own Sabbath Economics resources. Gandhi later paraphrased the basic lesson of Exodus 16 when he said famously, "The earth has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed." So it's always good to remember this as the basic purpose of human social organization, to guarantee enough for everyone, and that this will only occur if limits are set on production and consumption. It's not hard to see how crucial this kind of old wisdom is in our history, in our historical moment, where the specter of ecological collapse and economic disparity, because of our refusal to live within limits, is painting our history into a corner. But now you might be thinking, particularly those of you familiar with the teaching of John 6, you might be thinking, well, isn't Jesus actually repudiating or qualifying the old manna story, trumping its mere materiality with a more spiritual definition of bread? That reading of the text is an important way in which we tend to justify in our churches the radical spiritualizing of this central tradition. In the Catholic tradition, the wilderness feeding is turned into a metaphor for the Eucharist. In the Protestant circles, transcending the world of crude economics with a personal spiritual walk with Jesus. But I want to suggest that Christ as the bread of life should not necessarily, and I think it's actually problematic, to read that over and against the manna story, pitting the spiritual and the material. Rather, I believe we should understand the spirituality of the bread of life precisely in light of the manna story. And that is what I believe John is doing. Let me explain what I mean. Already in the manna story in Exodus 16, the manna represents more than the literal flaky substance that the people gather. It's much bigger. It's symbolic of the very life force that the Creator rains down on the world every single day. So I believe that this divine gift of manna alludes to the ancient cosmology. In fact, it is a metaphorical articulation of this ancient cosmology in which traditional people viewed the economy of nature, namely that a mysterious but persistent fecundity was woven into the very fabric of the world that sustains all of life. We find this very cosmology, for example, in Isaiah 55, where 2nd Isaiah says, "The rain and the snow come down from heaven, and they water the earth, and they make it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater." In other words, the entire economic cycle of human material sustenance is utterly dependent in the traditional cosmology on the gift of rain from above. Now that's a very traditional way of looking at the world, but it is the way most human beings have viewed things up until recent times. It's also true that we modern folk, not unlike Israel of old, have forgotten and forsaken this cosmology. In particular, we who are children of the Industrial Revolution, we fight this economy of grace with all our sophisticated might. And the thing I love about the old story is it actually anticipates this resistance and does so with a bit of humor. The word manna, as used in Exodus 16, is an untranslatable Hebrew phrase, manhu, which basically means, what the hell is this stuff? And I think that's profound because it suggests that we don't recognize the gift or the innate logic of the gift because we have been completely socialized into an imperial cosmology. In the case of the Israelites of old, they were slaves in the Egyptian empire. We today are slaves to the commodified universe of a consumerist capitalism. But this deft bit of humor also makes it clear that the manna is more than literal bread in the wilderness. It does mean that in the first instance. Remember, Exodus 16 is all about economic sustainability. But it's also this mysterious cosmic life force that makes material existence possible. In other words, this primal archetype of manna is both profoundly material and profoundly spiritual. And I believe that is exactly the point that Jesus is making in John chapter 6. The bread of God, he says, is that which comes down from the heavens and gives life to the world. It is that life force. And in the Christology of John's Gospel, Jesus himself is channeling that life force, which is why he is both feeding hungry people with bread in the earlier, immediately preceding verses in John, and inviting them to return to that ancient cosmology of living bread, of the divine life force, living symbiotically with that force, living symbiotically with the spirit that upholds the world. So I want to suggest that the Johannine notion of the bread of life and the ancient story of the manna in the wilderness are really one thing, not opposing things. In some ways, they are articulated, again, to draw on 2nd Isaiah, with this dream of God that everyone would have enough to live, especially those who don't have enough money, right? Money, even in antiquity, symbolized the market economy, and that market economy generated rich and poor. But in Isaiah's words here, he envisions a kind of ironic marketplace, or an ironic table feast in which people come and buy without money, meaning they receive as a gift not just enough, but in fact a feast, the great abundance. So bread sustains and enriches our life, our cultures, and when there's too little of it or too much of it, it divides people, and desperation or greed follow. Bread brings people together. Bread keeps people apart. So there's nothing more fundamental in the biblical discourse than the symbol and substance of bread. The Bible has a lot to say about it. So our study this evening is going to explore this material spiritual theme in the hopes that that will just provide an opportunity for the Bread of Life Church to remember and reflect again on why that phrase informs your life so deeply. It is, I think, our shared conviction that Scripture helps us build our imagination and courage to animate us toward mission. So what I want to do tonight is look into Mark's use of the term bread. We started out with John, but I want to explore the meaning in Mark for reasons which I hope will become obvious. 2.5 years ago, I had the opportunity to be in Palestine, Israel, working on the West Bank with Sabbath, the Palestinian Liberation Theology ecumenical organization. And after doing work on the West Bank, Elaine and I traveled up to the Galilee, and we went to the Sea of Galilee because for me I wanted to visit the place where our Christian movement began 2 millennia ago. It's been a long-standing dream of mine to stand at the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And one of the places we visited, and perhaps some of you have been there, is the Church of the Loaves and Fishes, which is just south and west of Capernaum. It is the traditional site of where the loaves and fishes moment allegedly happened. It's a beautiful Franciscan church, not overly ornate like so many holy sites in the Holy Land. And in the middle of the church is a rock erupting out of the floor, and that is the rock which tradition says was the table for Jesus' feeding of the multitudes. In front of that rock, which today is underneath the altar of the church, is a 4th century Byzantine mosaic of the loaves and fishes. This is a very famous image. You've seen this image before. Perhaps you didn't know where it comes from. This is its origin. And it reminds all of us that the heart of our tradition is a commitment to the bread of life, to sustenance and justice for everyone. Bread is a theme that appears, as I said, ubiquitously throughout the 4 Gospels. In Mark, this term artos in Greek, bread, it can mean bread or loaf, appears 19 times, 2/3 of which are in the 3 passages related to the wilderness feedings, as we'll see. Now, the first occurrence of bread in the Gospel of Mark is in chapter 2, which is a story of how Jesus' disciples simply helped themselves to the produce in a local grain field. This was an action that, as you might recall, got Jesus in trouble with the village authorities. Now, this episode reenacts the old Sabbath economic vision in a couple of different ways. The story recontextualizes 2 different teachings from Torah. On one hand, Jesus is well aware that in Leviticus 19, the so-called social holiness code, it stipulated that poor folk had inherent gleaners' rights to sustenance. The text recognizes that the people who stake claim to property don't actually own 100% of their own field. The poor have a right to the edges of that field, or the remainder. The sojourner is also mentioned here, a technical term in antiquity for undocumented immigrants. Anyone who had been forced in the dominant economy into marginality have rights to sustenance. And this is a warning in the biblical tradition against the temptation to extract for our own private benefit every ounce of produce or profit from the natural resources that we exploit. Because from the true owner of the field's perspective, a measure of the earth's gift always belongs to the disadvantaged. This ancient agricultural wisdom obviously challenges sharply our modern notions of absolute ownership, and it's one of the pillars of the ethos of Sabbath economics. This is not a marginal tradition in Torah. It lays right at the heart of this Sabbath ethos, as we can see from this text in Exodus 23, which states that not only at every harvest, but every 7th year, the entire field reverts to the poor and to wild animals. So Jesus' grain field action in Mark 2 is just reasserting these old principles by reauthorizing the work of gleaning on the Sabbath as the divinely ordained right of hungry people. And as you know, Jesus, in his defense of the disciples gleaning in Mark 2, concludes that conflict story with this famous teaching: the human one is Lord even over the Sabbath. And I've argued at some length elsewhere that insofar as Sabbath in the deep tradition is a metaphor for the economy or for economics, we can read this teaching as I have it here. The purpose of economics is to serve people. People were not made to serve the economy. The human one is sovereign even over economics. Of course, that's still a very controversial notion in our churches, who would prefer to stay in the realm of the spiritual and not to engage in questions of economics, but that's why we all do the work that we do. So that's the first time that bread is mentioned in Mark's gospel. But of course, as I said, 2/3 of the mention of this term artos occur in the wilderness feeding tradition. Now, Mark narrates the wilderness feeding not once, as in John's gospel, but twice. And that fact is key both to the plot of Mark's gospel and to the importance of this demonstration project. In other words, such an important story, Mark has to tell it twice. In fact, all throughout this section of Mark's gospel, we have a series of twinned episodes. It's part of the larger narrative strategy of the first half of Mark's gospel narrative. And I just briefly acknowledge a little bit of the architecture of Mark. To understand the second major section in Mark's gospel, roughly chapters 4 to 8, we need to understand the symbolic way in which geography and travels across that geography function. Jesus' ministry is narrated in two cycles, one of which takes place on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, and one cycle which takes place on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus and the disciples are constantly crisscrossing the sea back and forth from one side to the other side. There are two major exorcisms. There are two sets of paired healings, one on the Jewish side, one on the Gentile side. There are two wilderness feedings, and there are two moments in which the disciples are puzzled by what Mark calls the mystery of the loaves. So I won't expect you to sort of internalize all this, but trust me, that's the key to reading the first half of Mark. Hence, there are 4 crossing journeys across the Sea of Galilee. You see a map here. There are 3 boat voyages to the southeast side of the sea, that is the Gentile Sea. The first one happens at the end of chapter 4. The second one happens after the first wilderness feeding in chapter 6, right? That's actually an unsuccessful attempt to cross from one side or the other. Then there's a land journey which circumnavigates the Sea of Galilee in chapter 7, and finally in chapter 8 we have this third traversal of the Sea of Galilee. So it's a big, important part of the plot of Mark, and the boat crossings obviously have many meanings in Mark, but at the symbolic level they represent, or they mean to narrate the fact that crossing from one world to another, particularly traversing ethnic and national boundaries to go to the other, is full of conflict and full of barriers. Sometimes it seems like the wind and the waves are against us when we try to transgress those traditional boundaries of race or class or gender or sexuality or whatever it may be, nation, state. So that's a big part of the plot of Mark. And well, let's pick up Mark's narrative at the conclusion of the second boat crossing. That is, Mark goes to the Gentile side and then comes back to the Jewish side, and we pick it up here in Mark chapter 6. The apostles gather around. Jesus sends them off to a deserted place, practicing a little Sabbath for the movement. But as so often is the case in Mark, even this secluded place, even this R&R time is immediately overwhelmed by needy people. You all know a thing or two about this there at the Festival Center there in Adams Morgan. It's hard to close the door. to folk in need. So basically, Jesus sends them away, and all the crowds go, and Jesus with them, and they go by boat, and the crowds follow. We pick up this story where he comes ashore in the boat, and he sees this great crowd, and he has compassion. The emphasis here is on the remoteness of the place, but also upon the press of the crowds. The phrase, "they were like sheep without a shepherd," is obviously an allusion to the book of Joshua, where Moses is looking out on the people of Israel and lamenting that there are not enough shepherds for the sheep, meaning true leaders. It grows late, and the disciples come to Jesus and say, "Hey, this is Nowheresville. The hour is growing late. Send all these people away so that they may go into the surrounding country villages and buy something for themselves to eat." Sorry that that's cut off there. Mark 6:34 to 36. Well, this is really interesting that the disciples' imagination of how to feed hungry people is limited by what the market will bear. Send them away so they can buy themselves something to eat. It's one of the many times in which the disciples clearly don't understand what's going on. So Jesus responds in some of the most chilling words in the gospel tradition. "Actually, I have a better idea. You feed them." And as is so typical of the disciples in Mark's gospel, they resist this. They push back, saying, "How the heck are we supposed to buy this many people food? We've only got, a few bucks worth of bread." So you can see that both the sort of market consciousness on one hand and the selfishness and consciousness of scarcity, sort of all the wrong way of thinking, even though it daily typifies us. So Jesus pushes back again, saying, "All right, let's determine what we have on hand." You know this story. How many loaves? Go and see. They discover that they have famously 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then an interesting thing happens in the story. Jesus starts to organize. He orders them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. Sounds a little bit like the formation of Church of the Savior into mission groups. So they sit down in small churches. We miss a lot if we don't pay attention to the details in these stories. Then, of course, the culmination of this famous story is Jesus distributes the bread and the fish to all the folk, and we are told at the conclusion of the story, everyone ate and was satisfied and took up 12 baskets full of crumbs and fish. And those who ate the loaves numbered 5,000, and that's just counting the men. Now, it's long been recognized, I'm sure you're familiar, that the verbs that are articulated in Mark's narrative of the distribution of these loaves tell a really interesting story. Here are the verbs in Greek: taking, blessing, eulogisan, right, for the word from which we get eulogy, blessing, breaking, and giving. Well, of course, you don't have to be a genius to know that those are exactly the same verbs in the same sequence that is used at the Last Supper story in Mark. Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples. Now, obviously, we have a tradition of reading the Bible backwards, so we imagine the way we explain this correspondence, we say, well, obviously the feeding in the wilderness is therefore supposed to be seen as some kind of spiritual foreshadowing of the Eucharist. Well, it may be that, but the commonsensical way of reading the story actually suggests that we ought to read the Last Supper through the lens of the wilderness feeding. That is, that the Last Supper, the central liturgy in our church, is actually a demonstration project in Sabbath economics. Now, to try to delve into this a little bit more, let's look at some of the biblical underpinnings to the famous story of the loaves and fishes. The allusions to the manna story in Exodus 16 are obvious and clear. The wilderness setting, the plot to feed hungry people, and of course the punchline, there needs to be enough for everyone. So that's, I think, kind of supposed to be pretty obvious to a reader of the New Testament. Less understood is the connection to the feeding of Elisha that we find in 2 Kings 4. It's important for us to understand that this story of the great prophet Elisha, successor to Elijah, comes at a time when there's famine widespread through the land. And the company of prophets, right? In antiquity, there were these prophetic schools that attached themselves to great sign prophets. And so Elisha is traveling with this company of prophets, and they come on to this poor household, and they're supposed to make, the household's supposed to make a meal for this company on prophets. Well, they can't even feed themselves. So we're told that one of them goes out and gathers herbs, found a wild gourd, and comes back and makes soup, and didn't actually know what it was. And when they pour out the soup, the prophets cry out, "There's death in the pot," which is kind of a biblical euphemism, meaning they were all running for the lavatory. They immediately felt sick, and they could not eat it. And the story ends by Elisha throwing a little bit of flour on the soup and actually healing the soup pot. It's a very, very poignant story of the dire straits of human beings in a time of famine, where they're so hard-pressed, they have to go out and hunt and gather a little bit just to meet basic needs. The problem is we are so far removed from the culture of knowing what is edible, and this was even true for these folks back then, that we inevitably are going to gather something poisonous or something that's not good to eat. So it's a poignant story of just making do. Of course, that leads us to imagine, right? This is what we can call the biblical imagination, riffing off various stories. That brings to mind the fact that in the Bible, famine is always a social disaster, not just an environmental one or a natural one. That's perfectly articulated in the famous story of Joseph in Genesis 47. That's where Joseph manages the 7 years of famine on behalf of Pharaoh, and essentially forces his own people to come into servitude, first by buying up all the food and cattle, then buying up all the land, and finally forcing the people to come in as chattel slaves. That's how the people get into slavery in Egypt, and it's at the hand of one of their own working as a bureaucrat for Pharaoh. So famine struck horror in the imagination and memory of Israelites, and the Elisha story is invoking that, the horrors of famine. And that's why the fundamental plot of the Elisha cycle is feeding hungry people in a time of famine. So the soup story is followed in good Catholic worker style by a bread story. A man comes from Baal Shalisha, and bringing barley loaves, first fruits, and Elisha says, "Give this to the people that they may eat." But the servant pushes back, saying, "How can I set this before 100 people?" And Elisha repeats himself, "Give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says Yahweh, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. Now, it ought not to be surprising that here we have a prototype for the loaves and fishes moment in the wilderness at the time of Jesus. It's the exact same structure of the story. Scarcity, just a few loaves, and mysterious enoughness of the loaves. In the Jesus story, like here, there's actually no magic narrated. What is narrated is organizing and redistribution so that there's enough. The multiplication may be implied, but what's explicit is a community determining what it has on hand and making it work for everyone. Now, there's yet another biblical allusion here, the fact that these are barley loaves. Now, we Christians probably miss this detail because we're not particularly interested in detail much at all anyway, because we're so anxious to get to the spiritual meaning. But barley loaves would have been in the possession of priests, and they would have been on their way to the altar, because this was at the time of Shavuot. That's what's implied by the barley loaves, in which the priests bring barley loaves to the altar for the celebration of first fruits. Shavuot is the harvest feast, and it's very interesting in the biblical tradition how the liturgy of Shavuot, or also known as the Feast of Weeks, is identical to the numerology of the biblical Jubilee. That is 7 times 7. 7 weeks is Shavuot. And on the 50th day, there's this new offering of the barley loaves. Similarly, 7 weeks of years in the Jubilee, biblical Jubilee, and on the 50th year, slaves are released, land is returned, and debts are freed. So Sabbath Economics is just, the footprint is everywhere, running through all of these stories, and the biblical writers knew it, hence their allusions back and forth. The question is, do we know it? Well, all of this is just under the surface of the loaves and fishes story in Mark 6. And not only is it pointing backwards to the Hebrew Bible, it's also anticipating the history of the church. Shavuot was known in the time of Jesus as Pentecost, and that's why Pentecost is 50 days, and the first Eucharist in the life of the church in the power of the Spirit is narrated in Acts 2, and in Acts 2 there's a amazing redistribution, first of cultural power in the distribution of tongues at the beginning of Acts 2, and then the distribution of economic resources at the end of Acts 2. That's when everyone sold their goods to make sure that everyone had enough. So that's a pretty interesting mosaic or tapestry, and I just want to review it with you, and hopefully you have a handout that Mike has passed out, and on one side of the handout is this chart. So when we're thinking of the relationship between the bread in the wilderness story, the Last Supper story, take, bless, break, give, our imaginations are being invited to remember the manna story, to remember the idea of the 7th year Sabbath, the principle of gleaning, to remember the Jubilee tradition and the tradition of debt release. So there's a whole stream of Sabbath Economics memory in that trajectory. We're also invited to remember the realities of the social disaster of famine and the unequal distribution of wealth and how poor people get by. And we are invited to remember the Feast of Shavuot, which remembers the principle of Jubilee redistribution at every first harvest. And not only are we looking back, but these stories are anticipating the life of the church, both in Acts 2 and later in 1 Corinthians, where Paul refuses to celebrate Eucharist as a meal, as an unequal meal between economically and socially unequal people. That's narrated in 1 Corinthians 11. And he shuts the whole liturgy down because the Eucharist is supposed to be a meal that reflects the values of Sabbath economics, not that mirrors the disparities of society. So that's a lot being woven into the fabric of that great story of Jesus feeding in the wilderness. Now we know that there is a second feeding, and on the other side of your sheet that you have, and Mike, maybe you can just chat into the box here to let me know that folks have these sheets and are looking at them. On the reverse side, you've got a sheet with some parallel columns, and those columns, there are 3 columns. I want you just to look at the first 2. They put side by side the feeding. Adela, you can look at this. The feeding, the 2 feedings in the wilderness in chapter 6 and chapter 8 of Mark. Now, what I'd like you to do is just take 5 or 8 minutes. Maybe just cluster. I'm not sure how you're gathered there, whether you're in a semicircle or in rows, but if you can just cluster maybe in groups of 2 or 3, and put your glasses on and look at those first 2 columns and just take a pen and circle some of the images that you see in common between these 2 stories, these 2 wilderness feedings, some of the similarities and perhaps also some of the differences. You'll notice that the second one is the feeding that takes place on the Gentile side of the sea. It's in the region of the Decapolis, we're told in Mark 7:31. So just as the first feeding proliferated with Jewish images, as we've just seen, so this second one now has a number of semantic and symbolic references to the Gentile world. Go ahead and see if you can just mark down some of the similarities and differences. Let's just take a few minutes and do that, and I'll get up and stretch. To invite you now, Mike. Let's test the feedback loop here.
All right. Can you hear me?
But let's do this by. Yeah, I can hear you.
It's not bad.
Yeah, let's try it by voice.
We can get people to come up here or speak loud.
They can either speak loud or you can you relay it. What are some of the things that folk found?
Jesus had compassion for them.
Yeah, that's a big one that clearly links these 2 stories. They're grounded in a compassionate response. Good.
Next. Sitting on the ground is in both stories, is one comment.
Yeah, there's an organizing moment in both stories, isn't there? A little bit more elaborate in the first story, but you know, it's pretty basic small group work here, isn't it, folks?
Did you get that, Jed? No. Okay.
No, you'll have to repeat that, Mike.
That in both stories they say they don't want to send them away. Somebody does.
Right.
Jesus doesn't, and the disciples don't. Or Jesus doesn't.
Well, actually, in both cases, the disciples would much rather get rid of the crowd, but Jesus refuses to do so, and of course, that's in the second feeding. That's the line I've quoted there. It's just beautifully stated. If we send them away hungry, they will faint
Yeah.
on the way.
Lawrence, John, here. Come up here so he can just say it right.
In both stories, the disciples have no clue on how they will manage this impossible task. And especially the second story is interesting that they reacted the same way despite they recently experienced the first. And in Jesus' answer response is that he asked what we have and he blessed it.
Yeah. So you really see the same principle reiterated in the second feeding as you had in the first. You have a perception of scarcity. You have an organizing and reimagining moment. And did you notice that there are also, the numbers are very specifically recited in both stories? How many loaves? For some reason, Mark is interested in that bit of detail. And of course, that's going to be a clue to the meaning of these stories. And both stories end up in the same way, with folk being satisfied. Anything else anybody want to say about this synoptic
Well, he
viewing?
gave us the backdrop in Exodus of the wilderness experience, where the whole nation had this encounter with God. And again, in both of these versions in Mark, we've got this people in the wilderness where they have this encounter again.
Yep.
This is Janoki. I
Good.
almost see the two stories as two application of one formula, of the same formula or ritual, if you want. It goes through the exact same stage in the same order. The order, I mean, I've identified there's a crowd that needs to eat, and then Jesus wants to feed them. The disciple questioned that because it's impossible. There's not enough for everybody. Jesus asked the disciple, how many do we have? How many loaves? Then they give him the answer in very precise numbers. And then he ordered the crowd to sit down. He organized them. Then he takes the loaves, give thanks, give the loaves to the disciple for them to distribute to the crowd. Everybody eat, and there's lots of left over. And then the number of the people in the crowd are given. So it's like there's a principle behind it that is exemplified in these two stories.
That's an excellent summary, brother. And I suppose we can argue that if repetition is the key to pedagogy, Mark is trying to teach us something here. But it's also true that the disciples don't necessarily get it. So, and here, Mike, I want to ask you,
Like that. Things that happen to people when they're around us.
that's right. All right, so we're picking the story back up with the disciples in this final argument. And here's the argument. The Pharisees come, this is on land at Dalmanutha, the Pharisees come and begin to argue with him. Did you get my watch? And ask him for a sign, a Simeon from heaven to test him. And Jesus sort of rolls his eyes and says, why are you asking for signs? No sign will be given. Well, this is a very interesting moment because it's a remarkable echo of the text with which we started from John 6. Same Greek word, sign, semeion, from which we get our word semiotics. There's something deep in this tradition in the Gospels in which the loaves are the sign, and people don't get it. And I guess that's coherent with the original primal manna story. The folks don't understand the meaning of the manna. So even though here Jesus says he's not going to give a sign, in fact, he's going to give one sign. And here's how it unfolds. He gets into the boat, and now comes the conclusion of the entire discourse of loaves in Mark, and the last boat trip across the sea. Now, if you recall how the second boat trip ended, that's the text you have here in Mark 6. Then he got into the boat and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, and they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So there's something about this business of the bread in the wilderness that the disciples aren't getting. They're not getting it because their hearts are hardened. Now look at what happens in this last boat trip from Dalmanutha. He leaves them, gets into the boat, goes across to the other side. There's that classic statement. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring loaves, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. Now some of your translations obscure this. They oftentimes will be translated, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, they only had one loaf. The important distinction here is between multiple loaves and single loaf. So here we are, one last boat trip, one last conversation about bread. And now we're coming to the culmination of Mark's discourse, and you're following it in that right-hand column of your worksheet. And Jesus cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, right? So he's working the metaphor. And they're confused. Is it because we have no loaves, plural? And becoming aware of it, Jesus says, why are you talking about having no loaves, plural? And now comes a rather difficult rant by Jesus to the knuckle-headed disciples. Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Now, of course, that's a classic statement that comes all the way from Isaiah 6 with the famous call of Isaiah. Mark cites that text more than once. It came up in Mark 4 and the Jesus' Sermon of Parables. This is a full-scale struggle now between Jesus and the disciples. And then, after citing Isaiah 6, Jesus concludes by saying, and don't you remember? And as the reader, we may be saying to ourselves, remember what? And now we go through a catechism of remembrance. Jesus is going to go back over these two wilderness feedings. When I broke 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, and how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said to him, 7. And Jesus says to them, don't you get it yet? Of course, at this point, we, the reader, are like, get what? Like, what's going on here? It's one of the most curious and puzzling parts of the Gospel of Mark. Here's the key. The symbolism of these two stories, 5 and 12, are obviously symbols of Israel. 5 for Torah, 12 for the tribes of Israel. This was the feeding that was on the Jewish side of the sea. Jesus is trying to say, this symbol of the bread of life is for the people of Israel. But it's also for the Gentiles. the 4,000 and the 7 being the number of completion and perfection. Actually, different vocabulary is used for baskets, a Greek term in verse 20, a Jewish term in verse 19. It's very clear that the bread of life story is also to be extended to those who are not the people of Israel. What is it we're supposed to understand? Here we come to the singular plural conclusion. There are not multiple loaves for multiple people. In the boat, ancient symbol of the church, there is only one loaf. There's just one loaf in the boat. And that loaf is always in danger of being leavened by the yeast of those who would seduce us into a market way of thinking, into a scarcity way of thinking, into a commodified way of thinking. But the whole purpose of the wilderness feedings is to draw our attention back to the one loaf, the bread of life, the primal life force that has been the gift of God from the beginning, and is what we celebrate every time we lift up that one loaf in the wilderness. So let me conclude my comments with this image. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is a 45-year-old image here. This is the great Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Worker organizer, who had just been fasting for 40 days, 28 days, I think, in the mean fields of the grape growing in the Central Valley of California. And to break that fast, which was an important and central nonviolent part of the UFW campaign, the United Farm Worker campaign, Chavez, deeply committed to Gandhian tactics and deeply Catholic, decided to do a public Eucharist. And he invited then presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy to come out into the field and celebrate Mass. And this is a picture of him passing the host to Bobby Kennedy. This is a beautiful symbol of the way in which the one loaf expresses a commitment to Sabbath economic justice of enough for everyone, celebrated in a field among migrant workers, drawing in even the rich and powerful, such as a presidential candidate. It was quite extraordinary that Bobby Kennedy showed up to this moment as part of his presidential campaign in 1968, and less than 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy lay dead at the Ambassador Hotel, assassinated because too many people were afraid that he might actually take the visions of people like Cesar Chavez seriously. What I'd like to conclude with here is an invitation to all of you beautiful people at the Bread of Life community to embrace even more deeply the name you have chosen for yourselves. Living into what it means to be the bread of life is about food sovereignty and struggles for food sovereignty today all over the world. What it means to be the bread of life today is to serve the poor, to live into that ancient tradition from the 19th century to the 20th century to the 21st century of soup kitchens and food banks and food pantries for poor folk. What it means to live into the bread of life is to try in small ways to learn how to grow our own food and preserve our own food and reconnect with that primal life source. These are all pictures of growing and preserving that we do here at our place in California. What it means to live into the bread of life is faith-based organic farming internships like the Abundant Table Farm Project here in Ventura County that we're active in supporting, in which young people learn where food comes from and learn about food justice. What it means to be the bread of life is about labor justice and living wage. It's about Jubilee housing, it's about Jubilee jobs, it's about all the things that you are already doing and that you can do more of there at Church of the Savior. It's my prayer that you all will embrace this vision anew and afresh, understanding the bread of life, name that you've chosen for yourselves, fundamentally in terms of the vocation of Sabbath Economics. Mike, I think I'm going to stop there, again with apologies for the technical glitch on our part, and I think you're under a time constraint there, so if you all want to do some discussion, should I let you do that here? Do you want to do a little bit of Q&A here? What's your situation there?
I think we can have a few, if you have the time, we can have, give people the freedom to leave if they need to, but there are a few folks who might want to ask a couple questions.
Sure, I got 10 minutes on my end.
Okay, well, I'll just have people come up to this seat. And
Sorry, you can't hear the question.
comment or question?
Chad, mine is more just to express gratitude for who you are and for what you shared with us tonight.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. You weren't here at the beginning, so it's nice to hear your voice.
At Jubilee Jobs, we're having a sort of a wilderness experience. We've been trying to kick off this project where we train people through a bakery, and it's named the Grateful Bread, and it certainly at this point is still a very much a wilderness experience for us, but we are excited about it.
Well, that's got to be the awesomest name for a community bakery I've ever heard, and I hope you're all wearing tie-dye as you serve that bread in the spirit of Jerry Garcia.
All right.
I just want to say, as a grower and an organic farmer, that everything that you've discussed has such a cyclical nature to it, and that grace comes raining down, and that grace is consumed. You can use any place in nature and the vast ecosystems that we know to see a reflection of the idea that leaves grow on a tree, they die, they decompose, they add to the soil is enriched, the trees continue to grow, they bear more leaves, they fall again the next season. Everything is so cyclical, and where there are circles, I always thought there was God, and where there is ever a giving and a taking, and that kind of relational sort of exchange, just like the manna was, or the giving of the loaves and so on, that grace is being imparted. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Well, that's beautifully said, and perhaps there's a resonance between the great circle of story that we have in Scripture, in which the same themes keep coming back around and recontextualized and reiterated and said in different ways. In biblical math, in the great mystery of the circle, the 12 loaves and the 7 loaves, the 12 plus 7 equals 1 loaf. It's just such a beautiful image. And I challenge the Bread of Life community to, because I know you're probably looking for what to put on the keychains and the hats and the coffee mugs that you're trying to produce. So if you really want to do a conversation starter, then you can say 7 plus 12 equals 1, and then you can take an hour and a half and explain the great circle of story in Scripture around Sabbath economics and the bread of life.
Well, thank you, Chad. We're all very grateful and appreciate your